Captain Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cold metal wall of the command bridge and felt the station shake again. The vibrations ran through her bones like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Outside the thick windows, the stars looked wrong. They flickered and jumped as enemy ships moved between them and the orbital defense station called Defiance. "Status report," she said. Though she already knew the answer would be bad, Lieutenant Torres looked up from his screen. His face was pale and sweaty. 14 human ships left, Captain. The Hegemony Coalition has 230 vessels still active. He swallowed hard. Our fleet is falling back to defensive positions around the planet. Sarah watched the tactical display show red dots surrounding blue ones. The red dots were winning. They had been winning for 3 years now, ever since the Coalition decided that humans were too dangerous to let live. Every alien species in this part of the galaxy had joined together for one purpose: to wipe out humanity completely. They say we spread too fast. Admiral Reeves had told her before his ship exploded 2 hours ago. They say we adapt too quickly. They say we're a plague that will consume everything if we're not stopped. He had laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Maybe they're right. Sarah didn't want to think about that now. She had a job to do, even if it seemed impossible. The defense station was humanity's last major stronghold. Below them, the planet sanctuary held 2 million human civilians. If Defiance fell, those people would die. The Coalition didn't take prisoners anymore. "Incoming transmission from the Zephyrian flagship," Torres announced. Sarah nodded. "Put it through." The alien that appeared on the main screen had blue skin and 4 arms. Its voice came through the universal translator with a cold, mechanical tone. "Captain Chen of the Human Defense Station. This is Commander Vexari of the Coalition Fleet. Surrender now and we will make your deaths quick." "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said, "but I think I'll pass. Your resistance is pointless. You have 14 damaged ships against our full battle fleet. Your people have no allies left. No one will help you. Even the neutral species have closed their borders to human refugees. You are alone in the galaxy." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. It was true. Humanity had tried to make friends, tried to join the galactic community peacefully, but every species they met seemed to fear them. Humans learned languages too quickly. They adapted to new environments too easily. They took alien technology and improved it in ways that scared the original creators. "Maybe we are alone," Sarah said, "but we're still here." The alien commander made a sound that might have been laughter. "Not for long. You have 1 hour to surrender before we begin orbital bombardment. Your civilians will burn with your soldiers." The transmission ended. Sarah stared at the empty screen for a moment, then turned to face her bridge crew. They were all looking at her with a mixture of hope and despair. They wanted her to have an answer, a plan, some way to save everyone. The station shook again as Coalition ships fired on the outer defensive platforms. In the distance, Sarah could see the bright flashes of human ships exploding. Her people were dying and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Captain," Torres said quietly, "there's an emergency transmission coming from the planet. Dr. Webb in the deep archives." Sarah frowned. Dr. Marcus Webb was a historian and archaeologist. What could he want at a time like this? "Put him through." The screen flickered and showed a man with gray hair and wild eyes. He was in some kind of underground chamber filled with ancient computers and storage devices. Behind him, Sarah could see other people working frantically at computer terminals. "Captain Chen," Webb said, his voice urgent, "I found something. Something in the restricted files from humanity's early space exploration period. Before we had proper first contact protocols. Before we learned to be careful about what we might find out there." "Doctor, this really isn't the time for historical research," Sarah said. "You don't understand. The early explorers found things, made contact with entities that existed between dimensions. The government buried all the records, classified everything, made sure no one could access the research again. But I've been working on this for months, ever since the war started going badly." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of entities?" "The kind that even our ancestors were afraid to name. The files are incomplete, but there are references to beings that exist in the spaces between realities. Things that can cross over into our dimension when the right conditions are met. The early research teams called them by different names, but the most common term was the Whispered." "Dr. Webb, I don't have time for ghost stories. The Coalition is about to start bombing the planet." "This isn't a ghost story," Webb shouted. "This is our only chance. The files mention something called Project Pandora, a way to open dimensional gateways and make contact with these entities. The research was shut down after the first successful test because of what happened to the research team. What happened to them? Webb's face went pale. They all went insane. But before they did, they managed to record what they saw. The entities they contacted were powerful beyond anything we can imagine. And they were hungry. Sarah felt her heart racing. Hungry for what? Fear, Webb said. They feed on terror and madness. But Captain, if we could control them, if we could direct them at our enemies. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. You want to open a gateway to another dimension and release monsters on the Coalition fleet? It's the only option we have left. The gateway technology is complex, but I think we can reconstruct it from the partial records. It would take time, and we'd need authorization from someone with command authority. Sarah looked around the bridge again. Her officers were staring at her with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. Outside, another human ship died in a burst of flame and debris. Soon there would be none left. How long would you need? She asked. 4 hours minimum to set up the dimensional resonance array. Maybe 5 to be safe, and we don't have 5 hours. We have less than 1 before they start bombing. Webb leaned closer to the camera. Then we need to buy time. Find a way to delay them. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think. She could surrender. Try to negotiate for the lives of the civilians. But the Coalition had made it clear they weren't interested in prisoners. They wanted humanity extinct. She could try to evacuate the planet, but there weren't enough ships left and nowhere to go anyway. Every species in the galaxy had turned against them. Or she could authorize the most dangerous experiment in human history and hope that the monsters they summoned would be more interested in eating the Coalition than eating them. Dr. Webb, she said finally. You have authorization for Project Pandora. Do whatever you need to do. Webb nodded grimly. Understood, Captain. If this works, humanity might survive. If it doesn't, he shrugged. At least we'll go out fighting. The transmission ended, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the sound of dying ships. She had just given permission to open a doorway to hell itself. But what choice did she have? The Coalition had made it clear that there was no place in the galaxy for humanity. Maybe it was time to show them why their ancestors had been right to fear the dark spaces between the stars. Maybe it was time to prove that humans weren't the most dangerous thing in the universe, not yet anyway. 3 levels beneath the planet's surface, Dr. Marcus Webb wiped sweat from his forehead and stared at the ancient computer screen. The underground facility had been built during humanity's first expansion into space, back when they were still naive enough to think the universe would welcome them with open arms. Now it might be their tomb. Status on the dimensional resonance array? He called out to his team. Dr. Sarah Kim looked up from a pile of cables and circuit boards. The power coupling is ready, but I'm not sure about the containment field generators. These specifications are 60 years old, and half the equipment described in the files doesn't exist anymore. Then we improvise, Webb said. Use whatever we have. The basic principles should still work. The facility shook as explosions echoed from above. Through the thick ceiling, they could hear the distant sound of orbital bombardment beginning. Captain Chen had bought them some time by sending the remaining human ships on desperate attack runs, but it wouldn't last long. Webb turned back to the computer and continued reading through the classified files. The more he learned about Project Pandora, the more terrified he became. The original research team had been brilliant scientists, but they had also been reckless. They had opened doorways to places that should have stayed closed. The first successful test had lasted only 12 minutes. In that time, 3 entities from another dimension had crossed over into normal space. The research team had tried to communicate with them, to study them, to understand what they were. By the end of those 12 minutes, 2 scientists were dead, and the rest were screaming about things that lived in the spaces between thoughts. The entities themselves had been harder to describe. The surviving records called them living concepts of malevolence and intelligence without form or substance. They existed as pure thought, but thought that could affect the physical world in ways that broke the laws of physics. They could make people see things that weren't there, feel pain that had no source, experience terror so pure it drove them insane. Dr. Webb called out Lieutenant Carson, the military liaison assigned to the project. The Coalition has broken through the last orbital defense grid. We're getting reports of atmospheric entry vehicles. They'll be here in 40 minutes. Webb nodded without looking up from the screen. How are we doing with the gateway assembly? Almost ready, Dr. Kim said. But I have to warn you, the power requirements are enormous. We'll drain the facility's entire energy grid in the first few seconds of operation. That's fine. We only need it to work once. Carson stepped closer, his face grim. Doctor, are you sure about this? From what I've read in those files, these entities aren't exactly friendly to humanity either. Webb finally looked up from the computer. No, they're not. But they're not part of the coalition either. And according to the records, they're far more interested in causing fear and chaos than in actually conquering territory. If we can direct them at the coalition fleet. You're gambling with the survival of our entire species, Carson said. Our species is already dead, Webb replied. This is just our last chance to take our enemies with us. The facility shook again, harder this time. Dust fell from the ceiling, and several of the computer screens flickered. Through the communication system, they could hear panicked voices from the surface reporting coalition ground forces landing near the capital city. Power core is online, announced Dr. Martinez from across the room. Dimensional resonance field is building. Webb looked at the main display screen that showed their improvised gateway device. It was a circular metal frame about 3 meters across, surrounded by field generators and power cables. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, which wasn't far from the truth. The original designers had been working with theoretical physics that most scientists still didn't fully understand. Beginning dimensional probe sequence, Dr. Kim said. If the old calculations are correct, we should make contact with entities from dimension X7 in approximately 3 minutes. Webb felt his hands shaking as he watched the readings climb on various monitoring devices. The energy levels were incredible, far beyond anything normally safe to work with. But safety wasn't their priority anymore. Survival was contact, Dr. Kim announced suddenly. We're detecting responses from the target dimension. Something is aware of our probe. The temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees in less than a second. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked around nervously. The lights flickered, and for a moment the shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Dimensional gateway opening, Martinez said, his voice tight with fear. Barrier between realities is weakening. Webb watched the circular frame begin to glow with an eerie blue light. The air inside the circle shimmered and twisted, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. But this wasn't heat. This was reality itself being bent and stretched until it tore open. Energy readings are off the charts, Kim reported. Whatever's on the other side is pushing back against our equipment. The blue light inside the frame suddenly turned black. Not the absence of light, but actual darkness that seemed to absorb the illumination from the room's fixtures. Webb felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something's coming through, Carson whispered. The first entity emerged from the gateway like smoke given form and purpose. It had no fixed shape, constantly shifting between different configurations of shadow and nightmare. One moment it looked almost human. The next it was a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes. But whatever form it took, Webb could feel its intelligence pressing against his mind like cold fingers probing for weaknesses. 2 more entities followed the first, each one unique but equally terrifying. They moved through the air as if gravity was merely a suggestion, circling the room and examining the humans with what seemed like curiosity. Webb tried to look directly at them, but his eyes kept sliding away, as if his brain refused to process what it was seeing. One of the entities spoke, though it had no mouth, and the words seemed to come from inside Webb's head. The voice was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. Interesting, it said. The small warm things have learned to open doorways. How unexpected. Dr. Kim was backing away from the gateway, her face pale with terror. Dr. Webb, I'm reading massive psychic energy emissions. These things are broadcasting directly into our brains. We know you are afraid, another entity said, its voice like the whisper of dead leaves. We can taste your terror. It has been so long since we fed on fresh fear. Webb forced himself to step forward, though every instinct screamed at him to run. We need your help. Our enemies are destroying our world. In exchange for your assistance, we can offer you access to thousands of new minds to feed on. The entities seemed to consider this proposition. They communicated with each other in ways that made the air itself writhe and twist. Finally, the first one spoke again. Show us these enemies, it said. Let us see what manner of beings dare to threaten those who summoned us. Webb gestured to Lieutenant Carson, who activated the surface monitoring system. The main screen showed coalition ships in orbit around the planet, their weapons firing down at human settlements. Thousands of alien soldiers were landing in transport craft, spreading across the surface like a plague. The entities studied the display with growing interest. Webb could feel their attention like pressure against his skull, accompanied by a sensation of vast and alien amusement. So many minds, one of them whispered. So many different flavors of consciousness to explore and twist. Yes, we will help you, small warm thing. But know this, once we begin, we cannot be stopped. We will feed until we are satisfied, regardless of which side our prey belongs to. The facility shook violently as coalition forces reached the entrance levels above them. Through the communication system, they could hear human defenders screaming as alien weapons cut them down. Do it, Webb said. Whatever the cost, do it now. The entities looked at each other again, and then they simply disappeared. Not fade away or teleport, but vanished as if they had never existed at all. For a moment, Webb wondered if the entire thing had been some kind of hallucination, brought on by stress and desperation. Then the screaming started. It came through the communication channels from the coalition ships in orbit. Not human screaming, but the sound of alien voices raised in pure terror. On the monitoring screens, Webb could see coalition vessels beginning to drift aimlessly, their crews apparently no longer in control. What's happening up there? Carson asked. Webb watched as one of the largest coalition ships suddenly stopped firing and began broadcasting on all frequencies. The transmission showed the bridge of the vessel, where alien officers were writhing on the floor, clawing at their own eyes and screaming in languages Webb didn't recognize. The whispered have begun to feed, he said quietly. May God help us all. Admiral Thex Corey of the Zephyrian Empire had lived for 300 standard years and commanded fleets in dozens of wars. She had faced plasma cannons and antimatter torpedoes, fought boarding actions in the void of space, and watched entire star systems burn. Nothing in her long military career had prepared her for what was happening to her fleet. Status report, she demanded, though her primary arms were shaking as she gripped the command chair. 17 ships have gone silent in the last hour, reported her tactical officer, a younger Zephyrian whose blue skin had turned pale gray with fear. No weapons fire, no explosions, no distress signals. They just stopped. On the main display, Thex Corey could see the human planet below them. The orbital bombardment had been proceeding perfectly until the screaming started. The first ship to fall silent had been the coalition heavy cruiser Vengeance. One moment it was firing on human defensive positions. The next moment it was drifting in space while its crew broadcast images of their own nightmare-filled minds across all frequencies. What about the ground forces? Thex Corey asked. The tactical officer consulted his readings and visibly shuddered. Contact lost with all landing parties approximately 43 minutes ago. The last transmission we received showed... He paused, struggling to find words. Showed our soldiers attacking each other while screaming about creatures that weren't there. Thex Corey felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. As a Zephyrian, she possessed limited telepathic abilities that allowed her to sense the emotional states of other beings. Right now, those abilities were picking up something that made her want to curl up in a corner and hide. There was a presence in the space around the human planet, something that radiated malevolence and hunger in ways that bypassed rational thought, and struck directly at primal terror. Orders from the Coalition High Command? She asked. They want us to maintain position and continue the bombardment. They say the humans have deployed some kind of new psychological warfare technology, and that we need to push through it. Thex Corey made a sound of bitter amusement. The coalition leadership was composed of species that had never developed psychic abilities. They couldn't sense what she could sense. They didn't understand that this wasn't technology at all. This was something far worse. Admiral, called out her communications officer, we're receiving a transmission from Captain Ves Nalar of the Krex battlecruiser Dominator. Put him through. The screen showed a Krex warrior, a member of a species known throughout the galaxy for their courage and physical prowess. The Krex were 8 feet tall, covered in natural armor plating, and had evolved from apex predators. They didn't know the meaning of fear, except that Captain Ves Nalar was cowering in a corner of his bridge, his massive frame shaking like a frightened child. Behind him, Thex Corey could see other Krex crew members engaged in behavior that should have been impossible for their species. Some were weeping. Others were frantically pressing themselves against the walls as if trying to escape from something invisible. Admiral Thex Corey, Vesnalar said, his voice breaking. You have to help us. There are things on my ship. Things that aren't there but are there. They're in our minds showing us. The transmission cut off as the Krex captain was suddenly pulled away from the camera by something that couldn't be seen. The screen went black. Take us out of orbit, Thex Corey ordered immediately. Her tactical officer stared at her in shock. Admiral, our orders are to maintain position. Our orders are from beings who don't understand what we're facing. Move us to a safe distance from the planet. Now. As her ship began to pull back from the human world, Thex Corey used her personal communication array to contact other Zephyrian commanders in the Coalition fleet. What she learned confirmed her worst fears. The phenomenon was spreading. Ships throughout the Coalition fleet were falling silent, or broadcasting images of their crews in the grip of inexplicable terror. The entities, whatever they were, seemed to be moving from vessel to vessel with no regard for distance or physical barriers. They appeared inside sealed compartments, affected crew members who were isolated from all outside contact, and drove entire ship's companies to madness in a matter of minutes. Admiral, her science officer reported, I'm detecting massive fluctuations in local space-time. It's as if reality itself is being twisted and bent around the human planet. How is that possible? I don't know. The readings don't match any known technology or natural phenomenon. It's like something is reaching into our dimension from outside normal space and changing the basic laws of physics. Thex Corey closed her eyes and tried to use her telepathic abilities to understand what was happening. The experience was like trying to look directly into a star. She caught glimpses of vast intelligences that existed in ways her mind couldn't properly process. They were ancient beyond measure, hungry beyond satisfaction, and completely alien to any form of life that existed in normal space. And they were feeding. With each ship that fell silent, each crew that descended into madness, the entities grew stronger. Thex Corey could sense their satisfaction like a physical presence, feel their amusement at the terror they were causing. They weren't just attacking the Coalition fleet. They were playing with it, savoring the fear like fine wine. Her personal communicator chimed with an incoming message from the Coalition High Command. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to General Morthka of the Stellar Hegemony, a species that prided itself on logical thinking and emotional control. Admiral Thex Corey, the general said, explain why your vessel has left its assigned position. General, we're facing something beyond our ability to combat. The humans have somehow summoned entities that exist outside normal space. These beings are destroying our fleet ship by ship. Impossible. There is no scientific basis for such claims. You will return to position immediately and resume bombardment operations. General, I'm sending you tactical data from the affected ships. Look at the evidence before you, Aero. I will not tolerate cowardice from Coalition commanders. Return to position or face court-martial. The transmission ended, leaving Thex Corey staring at a blank screen. She looked around her bridge and saw the fear in her crew's faces. They all knew what was happening, even if the Coalition leadership refused to accept it. Admiral, her communications officer said quietly, we're receiving distress calls from throughout the fleet. The Gorvan Heavy Assault Squadron has gone completely silent. The Antarian battle group is requesting immediate evacuation, and the Stellaris command ship is broadcasting strange things. What kind of strange things? Poetry, Admiral. But not normal poetry. Words that don't make sense but somehow make you afraid to hear them. The crew is reciting verses about creatures that live in the spaces between thoughts. Thex Corey felt a chill run through her entire body. The entities weren't just driving beings insane. They were using their victims as transmitters, spreading their influence through the very communication networks that held the Coalition fleet together. Cut all external communications, she ordered. Emergency isolation protocols. Nothing gets in or out of this ship. But Admiral, that will cut us off from the rest of the fleet. The rest of the fleet is already lost. As if to prove her point, the tactical display showed another group of Coalition ships beginning to drift aimlessly. Their crews had either gone insane or abandoned ship entirely. In the distance, Thex Corey could see escape pods launching from vessels whose commanders had finally realized that retreat was the only option. But the entities followed them. They moved through space like living shadows, reaching into the escape pods and the fleeing ships with equal ease. Distance meant nothing to them. Physical barriers were irrelevant. They existed in the spaces between reality, and from there they could touch any mind they chose. "Admiral," her science officer said in a whisper, "I'm detecting similar phenomena spreading to other star systems. The entities aren't confining themselves to this battle. They're moving throughout Coalition space." Thex Corey felt her heart sink. If that was true, then this wasn't just a military defeat. This was the beginning of the end for the Coalition itself. Every species that had joined together to destroy humanity was now facing something far worse than anything humans had ever threatened to become. She opened a channel to her ship's internal communication system. "All hands, this is Admiral Thex Corey. We are withdrawing from Coalition space immediately. Set course for Zephyrian territory and prepare for emergency jump to hyperspace." "Admiral," her tactical officer protested, "we'll be deserting our allies." "Our allies are already dead," she replied. "They just don't know it yet." As her ship prepared to flee the battle, Thex Corey took one last look at the human planet below. Somewhere down there, the beings who had summoned these nightmare entities were probably celebrating their victory, but she wondered if they truly understood what they had unleashed. The humans had been afraid of losing their war against the Coalition. Now everyone had something much worse to fear. Dr. Marcus Webb sat in the underground facility and watched his greatest triumph turn into humanity's greatest nightmare. Through the monitoring screens, he could see Coalition ships fleeing the solar system in panic, their crews either dead or insane. The human defense fleet had been saved. The planet sanctuary was safe from bombardment. By any military measure, the plan had worked perfectly. But the Whispered weren't stopping. "Dr. Webb," called out Dr. Kim from her monitoring station, "I'm reading dimensional disturbances throughout human space. The entities have spread to 17 different star systems in the last 6 hours." Webb felt his stomach drop. "What are they doing there?" "The same thing they did here. Hunting, feeding, driving entire populations mad with terror." Kim's face was pale as she read from her instruments. "And Dr. Webb, they're not just targeting Coalition forces anymore." The main screen shifted to show a transmission from New Geneva, a human agricultural colony 2 systems away. The person on screen was Captain Rodriguez of the colony security force, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "This is an emergency transmission to any human authority still operating," Rodriguez said, his voice shaking. "The entities arrived here 4 hours ago. They started with the Coalition garrison that was occupying our colony, drove all the alien soldiers insane within minutes. We thought we were being liberated." Rodriguez paused and ran his hands through his hair. Behind him, Webb could hear people screaming in the background. But then they turned their attention to us. "The creatures, whatever they are, they don't seem to distinguish between human and alien minds. They're hunting our colonists now, showing them visions that break their sanity. Half our population is in psychiatric breakdown. The other half is hiding in sealed shelters. But the barriers don't seem to matter to these things." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Webb staring at a blank screen. Around him, his research team sat in stunned silence. The very people they had tried to save were now suffering the same fate as their enemies. "How is this possible?" Dr. Martinez asked. The historical records indicated that the Whispered could be controlled, directed at specific targets. Webb was already pulling up the original Project Pandora files, scanning through them with desperate urgency. "The records are incomplete," he said. "Most of the original research was destroyed when the project was shut down. What we have are fragments, secondhand reports, summaries written by people who weren't present during the actual experiments." Lieutenant Carson, who had been monitoring communications from across human space, turned away from his console with a grim expression. "Dr. Webb, we're receiving reports from 14 human colonies. All of them are experiencing the same phenomenon. The entities are spreading through human space like a plague." "But they saved us," Dr. Kim protested. "They destroyed the Coalition fleet." "They didn't save us," Webb realized with growing horror. "They fed on the Coalition fleet. And now that they've consumed all the fear and terror they could extract from our enemies, they're looking for new sources of psychic energy." The facility's communication system activated with an incoming priority transmission. The screen showed Captain Sarah Chen on the bridge of the defense station Defiance. She looked exhausted but alert, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Dr. Webb," she said, "I need a status report on our dimensional guests." Webb exchanged glances with his team before answering. "Captain, we have a problem. The entities we summoned aren't limiting themselves to coalition targets. They're expanding their hunting grounds to include human populations. Chen's expression didn't change, but Webb saw her knuckles go white as she gripped her command chair. Recommendations. We need to close the dimensional gateway and send them back to their own realm. The longer they remain in our dimension, the stronger they become and the more territory they'll claim as hunting grounds. Can you close the gateway? Webb looked at the improvised dimensional array that still hummed with otherworldly energy. The gateway itself was still open, though no more entities had emerged from it in the last several hours. But the equipment that maintained it was showing signs of stress and several key components were beginning to fail. I think so, he said, but there's a complication. The entities have spread far beyond the range of our dimensional anchor. Even if we close the local gateway, they might not be automatically pulled back to their home dimension. Then what would it take to force them back? Webb consulted the fragments of research data they had available. The answer he found made his blood run cold. According to the original Project Pandora files, the only way to forcibly return the Whispered to their home dimension is to sever their connection to our reality completely. That would require someone to enter the gateway and destroy the dimensional bridge from the other side. That sounds like a suicide mission, Chen observed. It is. Anyone who enters their dimension would be immediately exposed to pure psychic energy at levels that would destroy a human mind within seconds. But the process would also collapse the dimensional boundary and pull all the entities back to their home realm. Captain Chen was quiet for a long moment, thinking. In the background, Webb could hear reports coming in from across the bridge about more human colonies falling silent or broadcasting desperate pleas for help. Dr. Webb, Chen said finally, how long do we have before the dimensional gateway becomes unstable on its own? Webb checked his instruments and felt his heart sink. The equipment is degrading faster than expected. I'd estimate 6 to 8 hours before the containment field fails completely. And what happens then? The gateway would collapse violently, creating a dimensional shockwave that would probably destroy this entire star system. But it would also leave the Whispered permanently stranded in our dimension, with no way to return home. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a death sentence. If the Whispered couldn't return to their home dimension, they would be free to spread throughout the galaxy indefinitely. They would consume every sentient species they encountered, turning the entire galaxy into their personal hunting ground. There has to be another option, Dr. Kim said desperately. Webb was about to respond when the facility's alarm system activated. Through the speakers, they could hear the voice of a surface technician who sounded barely coherent with fear. Emergency alert. Emergency alert. Entities have been detected in Sector 7 and 12. Recommend immediate evacuation of all personnel to Level 9 shelters. Webb felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and move independently of their sources. On the monitoring equipment, he could see energy readings that defied explanation as reality itself seemed to bend and twist around. They're here, he whispered. The first entity materialized in the center of the room like smoke given malevolent purpose. It looked different from the ones that had first emerged from the gateway, more solid somehow, as if it had been feeding well and growing stronger. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from inside everyone's head simultaneously. Clever little warm things, it said. You think to close the doorway and send us back to the cold spaces between thoughts. But we have tasted the richness of this dimension, felt the exquisite flavors of terror and madness that exist here. We will not return willingly. Dr. Kim backed away from her console, her face pale with terror. Dr. Webb, the dimensional readings are spiking. The entity's presence is destabilizing our equipment. We are grateful for your summons, the entity continued. You have given us access to a galaxy full of minds to explore and break. In return, we offer you a choice. Join us willingly, and we will make your transformation into creatures like ourselves swift and painless. Resist, and we will savor your descent into madness for an eternity. Webb forced himself to step forward, though every instinct screamed at him to run. We summoned you to help us fight our enemies. That battle is over. It's time for you to return to your own dimension. The entity's form shifted and rippled with what might have been amusement. Our enemies? You misunderstand, small warm thing. We have no enemies. We have only prey, and this galaxy is rich with prey that has never experienced true fear. Around the room, the shadows began to move with their own volition. Webb could hear his team members beginning to whimper as visions of their worst nightmares began to intrude on their consciousness. The entities weren't just threatening them, they were already beginning to feed. Webb looked at the dimensional gateway array and made his decision. If humanity was going to survive what they had unleashed, someone would have to pay the ultimate price to close the door they had opened. He just hoped that when the time came, he would have the courage to walk through that gateway into hell itself. Dr. Marcus Webb stood before the dimensional gateway with his hand on the activation switch for the portable dimensional disruptor he had cobbled together from spare parts. The device would create a feedback loop that would collapse the gateway from the other side, but only if someone carried it through and activated it manually in the entity's home dimension. "Dr. Webb, don't do this," Dr. Kim pleaded. "There has to be another way." Around them, the underground facility shook as more whispered entities materialized throughout the complex. The shadows had taken on lives of their own, and every surface reflected images of nightmares that seemed to watch the humans with hungry eyes. Several of his research team were already showing signs of mental breakdown, muttering to themselves and backing away from threats that only they could see. "There is no other way," Webb said. "The dimensional gateway is becoming unstable. If we don't close it properly, the resulting explosion will destroy the entire star system." The lead entity, the one that had first spoken to them, materialized directly in front of Webb. Its form was more solid now than it had been hours earlier, as if it was becoming more real with each mind it consumed. "You would sacrifice yourself to send us away?" it asked. "How interesting. Most prey species simply run or beg when faced with their own extinction." "Maybe that's because you've never encountered humans before," Webb replied. The entity's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "Oh, but we have encountered humans before, small warm thing. Did you think this was the first time your species had summoned us?" Webb felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "The records you found, the fragments of Project Pandora, those were not humanity's first experiments with dimensional travel. Your species has been opening doorways to our realm for thousands of years. Every time you faced extinction, every time you stood at the edge of oblivion, some desperate group of humans would tear holes in reality itself and call for help from the darkness. Images began to appear in the air around them, showing scenes from throughout human history. Ancient civilizations falling to natural disasters, their priests and shamans performing rituals that opened brief gateways to nightmare dimensions. Medieval plagues that ended suddenly when mysterious entities appeared to consume the minds of the plague carriers. Wars that concluded abruptly when one side's enemies began experiencing mass psychological breakdown. "Each time you summoned us to destroy your enemies," the entity continued, "and each time we fed until we were satisfied, then returned to our realm to sleep until the next summons. But this time is different." "How is it different?" Webb asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "This time your species has spread across the stars. This time there are billions of minds for us to explore instead of mere thousands. This time we do not wish to return to the cold emptiness between realities when there is such a feast available here." Dr. Kim was studying the monitoring equipment with growing alarm. "Dr. Webb, the dimensional readings are changing. The gateway isn't just connecting to their home dimension anymore. It's connecting to multiple parallel realities. The entity's form expanded and shifted, becoming more complex and terrifying. Your summoning ritual was more successful than you realized. You have not simply opened a door to our realm. You have opened doors to dozens of dimensional variants, each one containing entities like ourselves but subtly different." Through the gateway, Webb could see movement in the swirling darkness. More shapes were emerging, creatures that were similar to the whispered but distinct in their own alien ways. Some were pure energy, others seemed to be made of crystallized time, and still others defied description entirely. "We are what you might become," the lead entity said, "in dimensions where humanity evolved differently, where your species chose the path of pure mental evolution over physical existence. We are your potential futures, and we have been waiting for you to develop enough to call us home." Webb felt the pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. "You're saying that the Whispered are actually evolved humans from parallel dimensions?" "Not evolved, transformed. In our realities, humanity faced the same choices you face now. Remain bound by physical limitations or transcend into pure consciousness and feed on the psychic energy of lesser beings. We chose transcendence. The implications hit Webb like a physical blow. The entities that had been terrorizing the galaxy weren't alien invaders. They were humanity's own potential future, given form and set loose upon the universe. And now, the entity continued, we offer you the same choice. Join us willingly and your species will become the apex predators of this galaxy. You will never again face extinction or defeat. You will feed on the fear of every other species until they bow before you or drive themselves mad trying to resist. Around the room, the other humans were listening with expressions of horror and fascination. Webb could see the temptation in their eyes. After facing certain death at the hands of the Coalition, the promise of ultimate power was seductive. What's the alternative? Webb asked. You know the alternative. You sacrifice yourself to close the dimensional gateways and trap us in this reality. We will be cut off from our home dimensions, forced to exist in physical space, and eventually we will weaken and fade. Your species will survive, but it will remain vulnerable to every threat the galaxy can produce. Webb looked around at his team, then at the monitoring equipment that showed the Whispered spreading across human space like a plague. In just a few hours, they had consumed the minds of thousands of beings, Coalition and human alike. If they were allowed to continue, they would eventually devour every sentient species in the galaxy. But there was a third option that the entity hadn't mentioned, and Webb realized it was probably because the Whispered themselves hadn't thought of it. Dr. Kim, he said quietly, can you modify the dimensional disruptor to create a partial gateway collapse instead of a complete one? Kim looked at him with confusion. Then understanding dawned in her eyes. You want to leave some of the gateways open but seal off the others? Exactly. We close most of the dimensional bridges to prevent unlimited reinforcements from crossing over, but we leave one or two connections open, just enough to keep some of the Whispered in our reality as a deterrent. The lead entity studied Webb with what might have been respect. Clever. You would make us into your guard dogs, keeping us just hungry enough to be dangerous to your enemies but not numerous enough to consume everything. It's better than the alternatives, Webb said. You get to stay in a reality rich with psychic energy, and humanity gets protection from any future threats. The galaxy learns that humans are the species that can summon nightmares when they're pushed too far. The entity was silent for a long moment, communicating with others of its kind in ways that made the air itself writhe and twist. Finally it spoke again. Acceptable. We will have enough prey to sustain ourselves, and your species will have the protection of the galaxy's most feared predators. But understand the price of this alliance, small warm thing. You will become the species that other civilizations whisper about in the dark. They will fear to anger you, not because of your weapons or your fleets, but because they know what you are capable of summoning. Webb thought about the Coalition fleet that had come to destroy humanity. Driven by fear of human expansion and adaptability, those aliens had been afraid of what humans might become. Now they would know. Do we have an agreement? Webb asked. We do. But the ritual must still be completed. Someone must enter our dimension to calibrate the partial gateway collapse from the other side. Webb nodded and activated his portable disruptor. Then I guess it's time to go. He stepped toward the gateway, then paused and looked back at his team. When the Coalition survivors ask what happened here, tell them the truth. Tell them that humanity tried to join the galactic community peacefully. Tell them that when they rejected us, we found allies who were much more understanding. With that, Dr. Marcus Webb walked into the dimensional gateway and disappeared into the space between realities. The partial collapse that followed sent shockwaves through dozens of dimensions, sealing most of the pathways but leaving just enough connection to keep a small number of Whispered entities in normal space. Captain Sarah Chen received the final report 3 days later. As surrender offers began arriving from across the galaxy, the surviving Coalition species were desperate to negotiate peace with humanity, offering territory, resources, and formal recognition of human sovereignty. They had experienced what the Whispered could do, and they never wanted to face such entities again. But Chen knew the truth that the galaxy would eventually learn. Humans weren't the most dangerous species in the universe. They were just the ones who knew how to make friends with the things that were. And sometimes that was enough to make them the species that everyone else feared to anger. The age of human isolation was over. The age of human dominance had begun. And somewhere in the space between dimensions, the Whispered waited patiently for the next time their allies needed them to remind the galaxy that some nightmares were better left undisturbed.